In 1954, Elvis Presley was just a teenager trying to find his place in the world. He was 19 years old, living in Memphis, Tennessee, with his parents, Vernon and Gladys. There was no spotlight on him, no fans waiting outside his door, no one asking for his autograph. He was simply a young man from a working-class family, doing what most young men his age were doing, trying to get through the day and figure out what came next. Elvis had grown up with very little. His family moved around a lot when he was young, following whatever work his father could find. They lived in small houses, sometimes cramped spaces, and there were periods when money was genuinely tight. Vernon Presley did what he could, taking whatever jobs were available. Gladys worked too, but the family never had much extra. Elvis grew up knowing what it felt like to go without things that other kids had. He knew what it felt like to wear clothes that were not quite right, to live in a neighborhood where nobody had much of anything. By the time Elvis was 19, the family had settled in Memphis. They were living at Lauderdale Courts, a public housing project. It was decent housing for them, better than some of the places they had stayed before, but it was still a life with a tight budget. Elvis was working at the time as a truck driver for Crown Electric Company. He drove deliveries during the day. It was steady work, and he was glad to have it. He gave part of his paycheck to his mother, as he always did. Gladys was the most important person in his life, and taking care of her mattered to him more than almost anything else. He had already been to Sun's studio by this point, cutting a record as a personal gift for his mother. He had sat across from Sam Phillips and sung into a microphone for the first time in a professional setting. But none of that had turned into anything yet. He was still a truck driver, still just Elvis from the courts, still someone that most people in Memphis had never heard of. What people who knew him during this time often mentioned was how polite he was. Not in a forced or rehearsed way, but naturally. He said yes sir and no ma'am. He held doors. He made eye contact when he spoke to people. His mother had raised him that way, and it stuck. Gladys had always told him to treat people with respect, regardless of who they were or what they had. That stuck with him throughout his life, and it was already visible in him at 19. He was also someone who paid attention to the people around him. Growing up poor meant he had learned to notice things, who needed help, who was struggling, who was having a hard day. When you have lived without, you tend to recognize it in others. It is not something you have to think about, you just see it. At 19, Elvis was at the age where a lot of young men are mostly focused on themselves, their own goals, their own social lives, their own future. And Elvis did have ambitions. He wanted to sing. He wanted people to hear his music. He thought about that a lot. But alongside those personal ambitions, there was something in him that was genuinely aware of the people around him. Friends from that period described him as someone who would notice if someone nearby was upset or struggling. He would check in. He would ask if someone was okay. He was not famous yet. He had not been shaped by public life or the pressures of celebrity. He was still just himself, a 19-year-old from a poor family in Memphis, working a regular job, living with his parents and carrying with him the values his mother had given him. That is the Elvis who walked through a parking lot one day and noticed a child who was crying. Not a star, not a legend, just a young man who had grown up knowing what it felt like to need something, and who had learned, somewhere along the way, to stop and pay attention. It was an ordinary day. Elvis was not on his way to a concert. He was not surrounded by people who worked for him. There were no photographers nearby, no reporters, no crowd of fans following his every move. He was just a 19-year-old going about his day in Memphis, the same way he did most days, quietly, without any particular attention on him. He was walking through a parking lot near a local store when he noticed something. A child, young enough to still be small, was standing near the parked cars, crying. Not the kind of brief cry that stops in a few seconds. The child was visibly upset, the kind of distress that is hard to miss if you are paying attention. And Elvis was paying attention. Most people in that situation do a quick mental calculation. They look around to see if a parent is nearby. They slow down for a second. Then they keep walking, telling themselves someone else will handle it, or that the parent will show up any moment. It is not that people do not care. It is that stepping into someone else's situation, even a child's, feels uncertain. You do not know what you are walking into. You do not know if your help is wanted or needed. Elvis did not do that calculation. Or if he did, he came to a different answer. He stopped. He walked over to the child and crouched down so he was at the child's level. That detail matters. He did not stand over the child and ask questions from above. He got down to where the child was, which is something you do when you actually want to make a person feel less frightened. It's a small thing, but it says something about how he approached the moment. He was not trying to solve a problem from a distance. He was trying to connect with a child who was scared and alone. He spoke to the child calmly. He asked what was wrong. The child, through tears, explained that they could not find their mother. They had been separated somewhere between the store and the parking lot, and now they were standing in an unfamiliar open space surrounded by cars with no idea where to go. For a small child, that kind of moment is genuinely frightening. The world is large and loud, and when the one person you depend on is not visible, everything feels wrong. Elvis stayed with the child. He did not look around impatiently. He did not flag down a store employee and hand the situation off. He sat with the child in that parking lot and kept the child calm while they waited. He talked to them. He may have made them laugh. People who knew Elvis from this period always mentioned that he had an easy, natural way of putting people at ease. He was not stiff or formal. He was warm, and that warmth came through even in small interactions. After some time, the child's mother appeared. She had been searching frantically, moving through the store and the lot, calling out. When she found her child, she also found this young man sitting nearby, keeping her child company. She was relieved and grateful. She thanked him. Elvis was polite, the way he always was, and did not make a big thing of it. He said something simple, the kind of thing you say when you are not looking for recognition, that he was glad the child was okay, or something close to that. And then he went on with his day. That was the whole moment. It was not dramatic. Nothing extraordinary happened in the way that people usually mean when they use that word. A child was lost and frightened. A young man stopped and stayed. A mother found her child safe. The situation resolved the way it should have. Nobody wrote about it that day. Nobody told the story that evening. Elvis himself never brought it up. Not to friends, not in interviews, not in any conversation that anyone recorded. The moment passed the way most quiet, decent moments pass, without any record of it at all. That is exactly what makes it worth talking about. When people think about acts of kindness, they often imagine something large, a grand gesture, a check written for a big amount, a public announcement, something that can be seen and measured and talked about. But most real kindness does not look like that. It is quieter. It is smaller. It is a person making a decision in an ordinary moment that nobody is watching, and then going on with their day without mentioning it to anyone. What Elvis did in that parking lot was exactly that kind of kindness. He did not just check on the child and move on. He stayed. That is the part that is easy to overlook, but it is the most important part. Stopping for a second takes almost nothing. Staying, sitting with a frightened child in a parking lot, talking to them, keeping them calm, waiting until the situation was fully resolved, that takes something more. It takes patience. It takes genuine concern. It takes a person who is not thinking about where they need to be next, but about the person in front of them right now. Elvis talked to the child. He kept the conversation going in a way that was calm and easy. People who knew Elvis personally from his early years in Memphis often described the same quality in him. He had a natural ability to make people feel comfortable. He was not the kind of person who filled silence with nervous energy or made things awkward. He was relaxed in a way that put others at ease. With a frightened child, that quality mattered more than anything else he could have offered. He may have done more than just talk. There are accounts from people close to Elvis during this period that suggest he often reached into his own pocket in moments like these, even when he did not have much himself. If the child was upset about something specific, a dropped toy, a lost coin, something small that had gone wrong before the separation from the mother, it would have been entirely in keeping with who Elvis was to quietly fix it, not as a performance, but simply because he could and the child needed it. He had grown up without enough, and that experience had not made him hold tighter to what little he had. It had done the opposite. It had made him more willing to give it away. He also made sure the child was physically safe while they waited. A parking lot is not a safe place for a small child to stand alone. Cars move through without always looking carefully. Elvis kept the child close, away from the moving traffic, in a spot where they could be seen easily when the mother came looking. Again, these are small practical decisions, but they reflect someone who was actually thinking about the child's well-being, not just performing concern. When the mother arrived, Elvis handled that moment quietly too. He did not present himself as a hero. He did not explain everything he had done in detail, looking for a reaction. He simply made sure she could see her child was safe, said something brief and kind, and stepped back. The mother's relief was complete, and Elvis let that be the whole story. He did not insert himself into it any further. After that, he left. He continued whatever he had been doing before he noticed the child. He did not tell his friends about it when he got home. He did not mention it to his mother, even though Gladys was the person he talked to most openly about his life. He simply did not bring it up. It was not a story he carried around and shared. It was just something that had happened, something he had done because it needed doing, and then it was over. That silence is significant. People who perform kindness for an audience make sure the audience knows what they did. Elvis did not have an audience that day, and he did not go looking for one afterward. He helped a child in a parking lot and then went home and got on with his life. That is what he actually did. And it was enough. The story did not come out right away. It did not appear in a newspaper the next day. Nobody called a radio station to talk about what they had seen. There was no post, no announcement, no moment where someone stood up and said, "This happened, and people should know about it." The parking lot moment stayed quiet for a long time, the way most small, private acts of decency do. It simply existed, known only to the people who had been there, and even they did not think to speak about it for years. The main reason was Elvis himself. He never told anyone. That was a consistent pattern with him when it came to the things he did for people privately. He did not talk about his good deeds. He did not bring them up in conversation. He did not use them to build a particular image of himself. People who worked with him, people who were close to him, people who spent years around him, many of them described the same experience of finding out, sometimes long after the fact, that Elvis had quietly done something significant for someone and had never mentioned it to anyone. The parking lot moment fits that pattern exactly. He helped a child, and then he went home and said nothing about it. There is something worth understanding about why a person behaves that way. When someone does something kind and immediately tells people about it, the telling becomes part of the act. The story gets shared because it reflects well on the person sharing it. There is nothing necessarily wrong with that, but it is different from what Elvis did. He helped people in private and stayed quiet about it afterward. That suggests the act itself was the point, not what came after it, not how it made him look, just the moment and the person who needed something in that moment. The mother who found her child that day knew what had happened. She had seen Elvis crouch down next to her child, keeping them calm, making sure they were safe. She thanked him. She knew his name because he told her, or perhaps she already recognized him faintly. By 1954, his name was just beginning to circulate in certain parts of Memphis, but even she did not go out and tell the story publicly at that time. She was a mother who had just found her lost child. Her focus was entirely on her child. The relief of that moment was everything. The young man who had helped was kind, and she was grateful, but the story belonged to a quiet afternoon in a parking lot, not to the public. The witness who eventually brought the story forward, whether a bystander, a store employee, or someone who had been nearby that day, held on to the memory for years before speaking about it. This is not unusual. Small moments do not feel like stories worth telling until something changes the context around them. When Elvis was just a truck driver in Memphis, the parking lot moment was simply a nice thing that had happened one afternoon. It did not feel like something anyone needed to hear about. It was only later, when Elvis became one of the most recognized people in the world, that the memory took on a different weight. That is how these stories almost always surface. Someone who knew Elvis before the fame or who witnessed something during those early years eventually sits down and talks about what they saw. Sometimes it happens in an interview. Sometimes it comes up in a book written by someone close to him. Sometimes it is passed down through a family. A mother tells her children what she witnessed, and eventually one of them writes it down or speaks about it publicly. The story travels slowly through personal memory before it reaches anyone outside the original moment. By the time it did come out, Elvis was already a legend, and that created an interesting problem for some people. When a story reflects well on someone famous, there is always a question about whether it is true or whether it has been shaped over time to fit the image people want to believe in. But the details of this story are consistent with everything else that is known about who Elvis was before the fame and after it. The parking lot moment would be easier to dismiss if it stood alone. A single story about a single afternoon could be a coincidence or a lucky moment, or simply someone having a good day. But it does not stand alone. When you look at the full record of Elvis's life, the accounts from people who knew him personally, the stories that came out over the years from friends, employees, strangers, and family members, what you find is not a collection of isolated incidents. What you find is a pattern. The parking lot was not an exception. It was an example of how he regularly moved through the world. People who worked closely with Elvis over the years described the same behavior again and again. He noticed people who were struggling and he did something about it. Not always something large, often something small and practical, covering a bill, buying groceries for a family he had just met, stopping to talk to someone who looked like they were having a hard time. He did these things without announcing them, and he did not follow up by checking whether people had noticed his generosity. He simply moved on to the next thing. There are specific accounts that illustrate this clearly. Elvis was known to pull over his car when he saw someone whose vehicle had broken down on the side of the road. He would stop, check what was needed, and if the person needed money for a tow or a repair, he would hand it over without hesitation. These were not people he knew. They were strangers on the side of a road. He helped them because they needed help, and he was there. He did the same thing in stores and restaurants. If he overheard a conversation where someone was short on money or struggling to cover something they needed, he would quietly step in. Sometimes the person did not even know who had helped them until later. Elvis was not always recognized immediately, particularly in the earlier years. He would pay for something, leave, and the person on the receiving end would only find out afterward what had happened. His generosity extended to people he knew well, too. Friends and employees from throughout his life spoke about moments where Elvis picked up on something they were going through, a family difficulty, a financial problem, a personal hardship, and responded without being asked. He bought cars for people. He covered medical bills. He helped families who were in difficult situations. These are the stories that tend to get the most attention because they involve larger amounts and are easier to document. But the smaller moments, the ones that happened in parking lots and on roadsides and in stores, were just as real and arguably more revealing because they happened when there was nothing particular at stake for him. What runs through all of these accounts is the same quality that was visible in the parking lot. He paid attention. He noticed what was in front of him, and when he saw something that he could do something about, he did it without stopping to weigh the cost to himself or the benefit to his reputation. That is not a skill that can be learned quickly. It comes from somewhere deeper, from the kind of upbringing that teaches you, early on, that people around you matter and that having a little more than someone else comes with a quiet responsibility. His mother Gladys is the person most often credited with shaping that side of him. She had raised him in difficult circumstances, and she had done it with a strong sense of community and care for others. She helped neighbors when she could. She believed in treating people with basic dignity regardless of their situation. Elvis absorbed those values early, and they stayed with him through all the years and all the changes that came with fame. The parking lot story is one moment in a much longer record. It is a small window into something that was present in Elvis throughout his life, a genuine awareness of the people around him, and a willingness to act on it quietly without needing anything in return. That is not a performance. That is character. There is a version of Elvis Presley that most people know, the one in the white jumpsuit. The one on the stage in Las Vegas, the one whose face appeared on posters and whose voice came out of radios in every corner of the world. That Elvis is real. The talent was genuine, the impact was enormous, and the fame was well-earned. But that version of him is also a public version. It is the Elvis that the world constructed around the performer. And like all public images, it only tells part of the story. The parking lot tells a different part. What happened that afternoon, a 19-year-old stopping for a crying child, staying until the situation was resolved, and then walking away without telling anyone, is not the kind of thing that gets built into a public image. It does not photograph well. It does not make a good headline. It is too quiet, too small, too ordinary to fit into the story of a legend. And that is precisely why it matters. It happened outside the frame. It happened when no one was building anything, when there was no image to protect or reputation to manage. It happened because that was simply who he was. The question of who a person really is gets complicated when that person becomes famous. Fame changes the context around everything. Every action gets interpreted through the lens of what the person has to gain or lose. A celebrity donating to charity is assumed to be doing it for the publicity. A famous person being kind to a stranger is assumed to be performing for someone watching. The cynicism is understandable because sometimes it is true. But it creates a problem when you're trying to understand someone who was genuinely decent, because genuine decency looks the same from the outside as performed decency. You cannot always tell the difference just by watching. The parking lot removes that problem. Elvis was not famous yet. He had nothing to gain. There was no publicist standing nearby, no photographer, no crowd. There was just a child who needed someone to stop, and a young man who stopped. The motivation could only have come from inside him, because there was nothing outside him that made stopping the more advantageous choice. He stopped because he wanted to, because it was the right thing to do, because that was how he had been raised and who he had become by the age of 19. That is the Elvis this story reveals. Not the performer, not the icon, just a person with a straightforward sense of responsibility toward the people around him. It also says something about the relationship between where a person comes from and how they treat others. Elvis grew up without much. He knew what it felt like to be in a difficult situation with limited options. That kind of background can go two ways. It can make a person focused entirely on getting out of that situation and staying out, building walls, holding tight to whatever they manage to accumulate. Or it can make a person more open, more aware, more willing to recognize struggle in others because they have lived it themselves. Elvis went the second way. His years of having very little did not make him harder. They made him more attentive. That attentiveness showed up in a parking lot in Memphis in 1954. It showed up on roadsides and in stores, and in quiet conversations throughout the rest of his life. It showed up in the way people who knew him personally, not the fans, not the public, but the people who were actually around him described him when they spoke honestly about who he was. Fame is loud. It fills up a lot of space. It creates a version of a person that can be hard to see past. But underneath the fame was a man who had grown up poor in Memphis, who had been taught by his mother to pay attention to people, and who carried that lesson with him everywhere he went. The parking lot is a small story. But small stories are often the truest ones. And this one says something about Elvis Presley that no concert footage, no record sales figure, and no magazine cover ever could. It says he was a good person. Simply, and without any need for further explanation. A good person.